Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Here's my caffeine. In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Well, we are in the midst of a series of podcasts based on what I encounter as I walk my way and study my way through Revelations chapter 2 and chapter 3. This series of podcasts is going to focus on the messages to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, the offspring of a revival in Ephesus that occurred when Paul was passing through in one of his missionary journeys. Now, there are several ways to interpret each of these messages to these 7 churches. They're not exclusive. Each message is specific to that first century church. That's true. Very specific 7 instructions given to a very specific first century church. But alongside that message is another message that is for us today. How do I know this? Because you hear time and again, he who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, I'll get in more of this in these podcasts, but in the Greek, the type of verb used for he who has ears to hear, let him hear, it's a never-ending verb. He who has ears to hear, let him continually hear. This command to hear is not specific to the first century church. It's to all who read these words, which includes us today. So we need to pay attention to these instructions. Some of these churches present a cautionary tale. Some present encouragement to continue in well-doing. All are necessary today. He who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Today's submission is the church at Smyrna. So I'm calling this podcast, Dear Smyrna. As we journey to the second stop on our tour of churches in Revelation, we arrive at the ancient city of Smyrna, now known as Izmir, situated on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. Nestled along the Aegean Sea, Smyrna was more than just a picturesque coastal town. It was a thriving cultural and commercial powerhouse in the ancient world. By the 1st century A.D., Smyrna had risen to become one of the most prominent Greek cities in Asia Minor, rivaling even Ephesus in influence, wealth, and prestige. Its carefully planned streets, impressive public buildings, and magnificent temples were a testament to its Hellenistic heritage and Roman prosperity. The city was laid out in a way that captured both beauty and utility, with a large harbor, broad avenues, and a well-organized street grid that made it a model of urban planning in the ancient world. Smyrna was also a fierce competitor in the arena of political loyalty. It had a long history of allegiance to Rome. And by the time of John's writing in Revelation, it had become a center for emperor worship. Public festivals and athletic contests, similar in style to the Olympic Games, were regularly held in honor of Caesar. These events weren't just about athletics or entertainment. They were also deeply tied to expressions of loyalty to the Roman state and the imperial cult. Participation in these events often meant acknowledging Caesar as Lord, which placed early Christians in direct conflict with the dominant culture. Its strategic location on the Aegean coast made Smyrna a natural hub for trade and commerce. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked in its bustling harbor, bringing with them goods, ideas, and people from all over the empire. This economic vitality brought wealth and cultural diversity. But it also meant that pagan religions and philosophies flourished, and Christians faced increasing social and economic pressure to conform. And yet, it is to this city, full of power, prestige, and pressure, that Jesus writes one of his most sympathetic and encouraging messages in Revelation chapter 2. The believers in Smyrna, though materially poor and persecuted, are called rich by the risen Christ. In a city known for its beauty and strength, It was the faithfulness of the church under fire that truly stood out. The point of this short letter to Smyrna was to warn of coming persecution, which approximately 30 years later resulted in the martyrdom of Polycarp, John's disciple and the bishop of Smyrna. He was indeed faithful even to the point of death. Another thought in my mind is that Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, may very well have been working in Smyrna when John wrote down the Revelation. And if that's indeed the case, then we can say, well done to Polycarp. Why? Because Smyrna received no rebuke from Jesus. More on that later. I would say Polycarp did an outstanding job. Now, let's discuss a little bit about the power and the pressure of emperor worship in the Roman world. Smyrna was known for its strong loyalty to Rome and emperor worship, as I mentioned before. Christians who refused to worship the emperor were viewed as traitors, leading to severe persecution. One famous example, as I mentioned before, was Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who was martyred sometime around 155 AD. Emperor worship in Rome during the first century was a key part of Roman religious and political life. It involved the veneration of the Roman emperor as a divine or semi-divine figure, reinforcing loyalty to the state and unifying the vast empire under the emperor's rule. In the Roman Empire, emperor worship was more than a religious ritual. It was a political reality, woven into the fabric of civic life. While the city of Rome itself was often cautious about declaring living emperors as gods, the provinces, places like Asia Minor, where cities like Ephesus and Smyrna thrived, they enthusiastically embraced the imperial cult. Local elites and provincial governors saw this practice as a way to prove their loyalty to Caesar and to gain favor with Rome. They financed temples. They sponsored festivals. They appointed priesthoods dedicated to honoring the emperor. These provincial cults often led the charge in promoting the worship of the emperor's image, even when Rome was officially more reserved. After an emperor died, he was often declared divus, divine, by the Senate. But some, like Domitian, who ruled from 81 AD to 96 AD, demanded divine honors while still alive, adopting titles like Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. I'm sure I mispronounced that. Please forgive me. These weren't just vanity titles. They were political tools used to reinforce the emperor's absolute authority. Public ceremonies, including sacrifices to the emperor's image, became common, especially on state holidays or the emperor's birthday. In many cities, participating in these rituals wasn't just encouraged, it was expected, even required. This created a growing problem for those who worshiped the one true God. The Jewish communities of the empire, with their long-established monotheistic traditions, were generally granted exemptions from these practices. Rome respected their ancient faith and often viewed it as a unique exception. But Christians did not enjoy the same protection. Though their spiritual heritage sprang from Judaism, their identity as a distinct and growing movement was soon recognized by Roman authorities. When Christians refused to burn incense or offer prayers to the emperor, it wasn't seen merely as personal religious choice, as was the case with Judaism. It was viewed as an act of treason. Their unwillingness to acknowledge Caesar as Lord marked them as dangerous dissenters in the eyes of Rome. This tension came to a head in the lives of early Christian leaders like Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, and Ignatius of Antioch, both of whom were executed for their refusal to worship the emperor. Their martyrdoms highlighted the growing conflict between the imperial cult and the kingdom of Christ. By the close of the first century, emperor worship was no longer optional. It had become a central pillar of Roman political unity and identity. And for the early church, this meant one thing: to be faithful to Jesus was to stand in opposition to the most powerful empire on earth, often at great personal cost. Now we're going to do a little bit about one of the early church fathers. His name is Polycarp. And this is important because he's the link between the last living representative of the apostolic era, John, and the forward movement of the church. He was born around 69 AD near the city of Smyrna, where he would spend most of his life. As a young man, he became a disciple of the Apostle John, grounding his faith in the first-hand teachings of the early church. By the early 2nd century, he had risen to leadership as Bishop of Smyrna, a role affirmed by encouragement from Ignatius of Antioch, his elder, who wrote to him around 110 AD during his own journey to martyrdom. Sometime between 120 and 140 AD, Polycarp penned a well-known letter to the Philippians, urging them to remain true to apostolic teaching, live holy lives. His influence was not just to Smyrna. It was across the entire face of the Christian world. Why do we want to pay attention to the early church fathers like Polycarp? Maybe the best way to explain this would be from my background as a composer. In early polyphony, the most important note is called the finalis, or the tonic. It's the note that the song or the phrase ends up on. It defines the key of the song you're in. It's called the finalis, the final note. The second most important note is a note that precedes the finalis. I call it the approach note. As I write the approach note, I realize that it sets up the finalis. That's its purpose. It prepares the ear that the finalis and the finish is next. The approach note highlights the importance of the finalis. In essence, the approach note's job is to point your ear to the finalis. It doesn't introduce anything new. It highlights the finalis. In the same way for me, early church fathers, Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, their job outside of proclaiming the gospel was to buttress and support and point the congregants' ears and eyes to the teachings of the apostles who point us to Christ. They are the approach note to the apostles' finalis. The apostles' responsibility was to bring this new thing, the gospel, to the eyes, ears of the first century converts. Beginning with the late first century and continuing from the 2nd century onward, the church fathers' job, in my opinion, was to proclaim and defend what the apostles brought to the theological table concerning Christ and the gospel. They became the front line in the intellectual war between Christianity and the world, building a body of apologetic works for succeeding generations to lean on as time marched past the apostolic age. As to this portion of Revelation, the message to Smyrna, Polycarp was either still with John as a disciple or was already living in Smyrna as a bishop when this letter was written. As John wrote and sent out this revelation from Jesus to the churches, the apostolic era closed. The next generation of church leaders, Polycarp, Ignatius, Irenaeus, they opened the door in what I call the early apologetics era, developing the science of apologetics as that discipline applies to the writings of the apostles. Their job wasn't to invent anything new, but to defend what the apostles established, i.e., to point to the apostolic teachings, much like the approach note points to the finalis in classical music. Now, let's get to the scripture. Revelations 2, 8 through 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. All right, let's take a look at verse 8. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. Of course, this is referring to Jesus. But it's also a statement alluding to the fact that Smyrna itself had died and come back to life, giving this historic city a connection to Jesus in an allegorical kind of way. Jesus is telling them that he knows who they are, the resurrected Lord comforting the resurrected city. Smyrna was originally a prominent city in ancient Anatolia, dating back to the early Greek period. However, around the 3rd century BC, Smyrna was destroyed by the forces of King Lysimachus of Thrace. He was one of Alexander the Great's generals, and after Alexander's death, he fought for control of various territories. After its destruction, Smyrna remained largely uninhabited for some time. Around 300 BC, Lysimachus rebuilt Smyrna, planning a more strategic city layout. He established a new Greek-style city that became an important center of trade and culture. The city's location along the Aegean coast contributed to its prosperity, and it remained significant in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. By the time of the Roman Empire, Smyrna had become one of the major cities in Asia Minor. It was rebuilt and revitalized during the Roman period. The city flourished as a center of commerce, culture, and learning, and it was often a site of religious tension between Christians, Jews, and pagans. It was a city that had been dead and was now alive. Verse 9a, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. These early Christians lived under constant pressure. In a city where so much of public life, commerce, celebration, and opportunity was wrapped up in emperor worship, their refusal to bow to Caesar came at a steep price. Trade guilds, public festivals, business dealings often required a token act of allegiance to the emperor, such as offering incense or participating in imperial games. But for followers of Christ, this was idolatry. Their loyalty to Jesus cut them off from economic success and social standing. As a result, many believers lived in material poverty, choosing faithfulness over prosperity. Yet in God's eyes, they were truly rich, rich in faith, courage, and eternal reward. You know, as an aside, I'm thinking about what's coming in Revelation, where it talks about the mark of the beast. You had to have the mark of the beast in order to do business, to buy or to sell. Well, the guilds of the time require, if you were to be part of these trade guilds, you had to follow their rules, and many of the rules had to do with worshiping and giving homage to the emperor. Well, Christians wouldn't do that. So they were cut off from much trade and business dealings because they could not be part of these trade guilds who controlled the marketplace. So when I read Jesus' words to the church in Smyrna, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you're rich, I can't help but reflect on the state of the modern church today and how often it contrasts sharply with this message. In our day, there's a widespread heretical teaching, what I often refer to as a prosperity gospel, that suggests God's favor is measured by wealth, success, and social status. According to this view, if you're poor, unknown, or struggling, it's a sign you've somehow missed God's blessing or you have failed in your faith. But then we come to these 11 simple words from Revelation. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. And they shatter that illusion completely. Jesus looks at a suffering, impoverished, persecuted group of believers with little to no social standing, and he declares them rich. Not in gold or influence, but in what truly matters, in faith, spiritual integrity, eternal reward. The world saw their poverty. Jesus saw their treasure. Smyrna stands as a powerful reminder that God's definition of success is not tied to bank accounts or public recognition. Instead, he honors faithfulness in hardship, courage in suffering, and loyalty that endures, even when the cost is high. These words to Smyrna speak directly against the idea that wealth is a measure of a person's standing with God. In his eyes, the church that has nothing in the world but holds fast to him is rich beyond measure. That's a truth we dare not forget. Now, the second half of verse 9 says, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. In the first century, Christians were often persecuted by both the Roman authorities and certain Jewish groups. In the beginning, early Christianity was viewed by many Jews and by Rome as a sect within Judaism, and for a time that protected Christianity from the Roman Empire because Judaism was protected by Rome. But as Jewish leaders rejected the way, which is what Christianity was first called, Rome eventually began to see Christianity as being separate from Judaism, and this removed their protection from the persecution of Rome. The synagogue of Satan refers to a group within the Jewish community in Smyrna who were actively opposing Christians and slandering them. Jesus used language like this when he addressed them in John chapter 8. It says, Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me. For I've come here from God. I've not come here on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to hear what I say." Here's where he says it. "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So John using the term synagogue of Satan, this isn't anything new. Some, though not all, Jewish religious leaders throughout the Roman Empire actually worked with Roman authorities to imprison, punish, or suppress Christians, particularly in the early church. Some followed Paul wherever he went, causing trouble for Paul at every turn. The Jewish elite, particularly the Sadducees, had a working relationship with the Romans. To maintain their influence, some leaders sought to distance themselves from Christians who were seen as troublemakers. Jewish leaders feared that Christianity would provoke Roman suppression of Jewish religious freedoms. So, some actually cooperated with Rome to maintain their own political status and to avoid potential crackdowns. What strikes me as remarkable is that even after Rome had devastated Jerusalem in AD 70 or AD 65, right around there, tearing down the temple, dismantling temple-centered Judaism, scattering the Jewish people, in essence, removing the Jewish nation off the map, some still harbored such deep resentment toward Christians that they were still willing to betray them to the very empire that had destroyed their own nation. Despite their shared suffering under Roman oppression, the hostility toward the followers of Jesus remained so strong that it overrode any sense of common cause or compassion. Verse 10, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. He's telling them specifically, there's a time of short and intense persecution coming. Excuse the tongue being wrapped around my eye tooth. Can't see what I'm saying. Let me have some coffee. History tells us that Smyrna did indeed see the fulfillment of this prophetic word. Polycarp, their beloved bishop, would be slain by Rome in Smyrna several decades after this sentence was written. Now, I don't know what to make of the statement, "You're going to suffer persecution for 10 days. As I don't know of a specific 10-day period such as is mentioned here. However, my guess would be that 10 days is a symbol of a limited but complete period of testing or suffering. Numbers meant a great deal to the Jews within Judaism, and John, who had come out of Judaism. The number 10 symbolizes a complete period of something. So when he says you're going to suffer persecution for 10 days, I'm thinking it's not literally about a 10-day countdown, but rather emphasizes that the suffering will be real, intense, but contained. God's in control of its duration and outcome. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Now, the phrase victor's crown tips its hat to athletic games like the Olympic Games. Another thing Smyrna was known for. Well, by the 1st century AD, Smyrna had embraced Roman imperial culture, which included gladiatorial contests, public spectacles. The city had strong loyalty to Rome, as I've mentioned, and the emperor, and it was often reflected in its games held in the honor of the Roman emperor of the time. And as a leading city in Asia Minor, Smyrna often competed with Ephesus and Pergamum for preeminence. Hosting impressive games and festivals was a way to showcase wealth, cultural status, and loyalty to Rome, trying to upstage other prominent cities in the area. The problem with Christians in these popular games is that the Roman games in Smyrna were considered part and parcel of imperial worship, as I mentioned before. which Christians oppose. Refusing to participate in the emperor cult and public sacrifices made them targets of persecution. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, as I mentioned before, was martyred in a public stadium around 155, 156 AD, perhaps even as part of some Olympic-type games of the era, reflecting the city's connection to public spectacles. Now, when I first became a Christian, there's a thing called the promise box. And in this promise box, I have all these verses, promises from God. And they're generally there to encourage, all these different promises of Scripture to encourage you in whatever situation you're in. But here's a verse you'll never find in the promise box. The devil will put you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. The truth is, persecution isn't optional for the faithful follower of Christ. It's inevitable. It was for them. It is for us now. For those who remain loyal to him, suffering in some form will come. But true believers hold fast to a deeper hope. Just beyond the veil of death lies a glorious eternity, untouched by sin, sorrow, or evil. Persecution is temporary. Paradise is forever. Just as in the days of the early church, persecution wears many faces. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, believers faced everything from public ridicule, like Paul did in Mars Hill, mocked by the intellectual elites of Athens, to imprisonment, beatings, torture, and even martyrdom. It's no different today. Around the globe, Christians still suffer for their faith. In the West, particularly the United States, the gospel is under constant intellectual attack, dismissed by cultural influences and academic institutions. In communist nations, believers are arrested and silenced. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, Christians are targeted and killed simply because they bear the name of Christ. Persecution remains the cost of discipleship, but so does the promise. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, verse 11. What the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Oh. What is the Spirit saying to the churches? The answer is in the second sentence. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Everyone will suffer the first death. That's whether it comes from natural causes, persecution, or execution. We will all die. We will all breathe our last breath at some point and die. But that's not the death we need to worry about. The second death, the lake of fire, eternal torment, eternal separation from God, and any hope of deliverance, that's the death we need to fear. So who is the victorious one who escapes this second death? Well, the believer who does not bow their morality, who does not bow their life to the world's demands and systems. If anything seeks to insert itself between us and our worship of the living God, we must turn our backs on that thing, whatever it is, and follow Christ. Stay faithful and receive the victor's crown. Thank you, Smyrna. This is Paige. My coffee. And I am out of here. Have a great and glorious day. Bye-bye. Don't forget to join me at www.patreon.com/coffeeBiblePage or my website, www.coffeeBiblePage.com. Have a glorious and blessed day. Bye-bye.